On the night of 14 December 1941, a British soldier stood on an airfield in the Libyan desert with a problem most demolition experts never have to solve. His explosives had run out. The aircraft in front of him had not. Rather than walk away and leave the remaining German and Italian planes intact, he climbed onto their wings, forced open their cockpits, and tore out their instrument panels and control surfaces with his bare hands, wrecking them one by one until there was nothing left worth flying. By the time he was finished, roughly 24 enemy aircraft had been destroyed at Wadi Tamet airfield, and not one of his own men had been hurt. His name was Robert Blair Mayne, though almost everyone who knew him called him Paddy. Before the war, he had been an international rugby player, a champion boxer, and a working solicitor. During it, he became one of the founding figures of the Special Air Service, and arguably the single most feared individual raider the unit produced. This is the story of who Paddy Mayne actually was, how he ended up tearing aircraft apart with his hands in the Libyan desert, and why a man recommended for Britain's highest award for valor 4 separate times never once received it. Robert Blair Mayne was born on 11 January 1915 in Newtownards, County Down, in Northern Ireland, into a prominent Presbyterian family that had built its standing on several generations of local retail business. He attended Regent House Grammar School, where he first discovered a talent that would define much of his early adult life, an extraordinary aptitude for physical competition, particularly rugby. Mayne went on to study law at Queen's University, Belfast, and it was there that his athletic reputation grew considerably. He became the Irish University's heavyweight boxing champion in 1936, and by 1938 had established himself as one of the finest forwards in Irish rugby, earning selection for the British and Irish Lions tour of South Africa that same year, a considerable honor for a player still in his early 20s. Teammates and contemporaries from this period describe a man of enormous physical strength and genuine rugby talent, but also one prone to volatile behavior off the field, including reported incidents of brawling and property damage during the Lions tour that hinted at a temperament considerably less disciplined than his athletic ability suggested. By 1939, Mayne had qualified as a solicitor and begun working at a Belfast law firm, continuing to play representative rugby for Ireland alongside his legal career. It was, by most conventional measures, the beginning of a comfortable, respectable professional life. The outbreak of the Second World War interrupted all of it. Mayne received a commission in the Royal Artillery in 1939, serving initially with anti-aircraft units in Britain and Ireland, a posting that gave no indication whatsoever of the reputation he would go on to build in the deserts of North Africa. In April 1940, following the retreat from Dunkirk, Mayne volunteered for the newly formed No. 11 Scottish Commando, a unit built for exactly the kind of aggressive raiding operations that conventional infantry units of the period were not designed to conduct. It was here, rather than on a rugby pitch, that Mayne's real reputation began to take shape. In June 1941, No. 11 Commando was committed to the Litani River operation in Lebanon, part of the wider Syria-Lebanon campaign against Vichy French forces. Mayne, commanding a troop in combat for the first time, led his men with a level of composure and effectiveness that immediately caught the attention of his superiors. He was mentioned in dispatches for his conduct during the operation, cited specifically for the calm, capable manner in which he handled his men under genuinely difficult conditions against a determined defending force. It was this performance at the Litani River that first drew the attention of a young officer named David Stirling, then in the process of trying to recruit personnel for an entirely new and unconventional raiding unit he was attempting to stand up, the Special Air Service. According to a story that has become deeply embedded in SAS regimental folklore, Mayne was recruited into the new unit not from a parade ground or a training camp, but from a prison cell reportedly awaiting court-martial for striking his commanding officer, Geoffrey Keyes, an aristocratic figure whom Mayne, by several accounts, held in open contempt. Whether this specific version of events is entirely accurate has been questioned by some historians who have studied the period closely, including researcher Gavin Mortimer, but the broader truth it points to is not seriously disputed. Mayne arrived at the SAS already carrying a reputation for both extraordinary combat competence and genuine difficulty with authority, and those two qualities would define the rest of his wartime career in almost equal measure. Mayne became one of the founding officers of L Detachment, SAS, training alongside Stirling and fellow officer Jock Lewis at the unit's makeshift camp at Kabrit, on the shores of the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt. He served as Stirling's second-in-command during the unit's disastrous first mission, Operation Squatter, a parachute assault against Axis airfields near Gazala on the night of 16 November 1941 that was scattered by one of the worst desert storms in decades. Of the roughly 65 men who jumped that night, only 22 made it back to friendly lines. Not a single enemy aircraft had been destroyed. Stirling, recognizing that the failure lay in the method of insertion rather than the underlying concept, abandoned parachute drops for raiding missions and turned instead to the long-range desert group for vehicle-based transport to and from targets. Barely a month after the disaster of Operation Squatter, a new mission was organized to strike 3 Axis airfields along the Libyan coast, Sirte, El Agheila, and Wadi Tamet. Mayne was given command of the party assigned to Tamet. It was here, in mid-December 1941, that Paddy Mayne earned the reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. Mayne led a small party of roughly half a dozen men onto the airfield perimeter at Wadi Tamet under cover of darkness. The raiding method itself was straightforward in principle. Move quietly among the parked rows of enemy aircraft, attach small time-delayed explosive charges, Lewis bombs, developed by Mayne's fellow officer Jock Lewis specifically for this kind of work, to as many aircraft as the limited supply carried by each man would allow, and withdraw before the charges detonated. What made the raid at Tamet remarkable, and what earned it a permanent place in SAS legend, was what Mayne did once his supply of explosives ran out, while enemy aircraft were still parked in front of him. Rather than accept that the remaining planes would survive the night intact. Accounts of the raid describe Mayne climbing onto the aircraft themselves and physically destroying them by hand, wrenching directional gyros and instrument panels out of cockpits, tearing at wiring and control surfaces, using nothing but raw physical strength to render aircraft unusable that he had no explosives left to blow up properly. One recovered directional gyro, physically wrenched from an Italian aircraft cockpit that night, later became a tangible piece of evidence for just how far Mayne had been willing to go once conventional methods were no longer an option. By the time his party withdrew, roughly 24 German and Italian aircraft had been destroyed or rendered unusable at Tamet, along with fuel stores and other airfield equipment, and Mayne's group suffered no casualties in the process. Elsewhere that same operation, Stirling's own attempt on the airfield at Sirte failed after his party's approach was compromised, and Jock Lewis's party found the airfield at El Agheila essentially empty of aircraft. Against that backdrop, Mayne's results at Tamet stood out as the single clearest proof. At a moment when the SAS's continued existence was genuinely uncertain, that Stirling's concept worked when it was executed by the right men with the right method of insertion. Tamet was not an isolated moment for Mayne. It established a pattern of aggressive, close-range raiding that he repeated and escalated across the rest of the North African campaign and beyond. He took part in numerous further airfield raids over the following months, contributing to a campaign total that saw the SAS credited with destroying several hundred Axis aircraft on the ground. By some estimates, more aircraft than the entire Allied Desert Air Force managed to shoot down in aerial combat over the same period. When David Stirling was captured by German forces in January 1943, the original 1st SAS Regiment was reorganized, and Mayne was given command of the newly formed Special Raiding Squadron, leading the unit through the invasions of Sicily and mainland Italy later that year. During the Sicily landings in July 1943, Mayne's squadron captured a key coastal gun battery critical to the safety of the wider Allied landing force, going on to seize 3 further batteries, several hundred prisoners, and inflict substantial casualties on defending Italian forces in a single operation. Action that earned Mayne a bar to the Distinguished Service Order he had already received for his earlier desert service. Mayne's wartime service continued through the campaign in France following the D-Day landings and into the final push into Germany itself in 1945, by which point he held the rank of lieutenant colonel commanding an SAS brigade formation. In one of the most frequently cited episodes of his later war record, during operations in Germany, Mayne's unit became pinned down and took casualties. Accounts describe him personally driving into the exposed area under fire to rescue wounded men, lifting them individually into his jeep, before destroying the enemy gun position responsible with close-range fire. It was this action that prompted Field Marshal Montgomery himself to sign a recommendation for Mayne to receive the Victoria Cross. That Victoria Cross recommendation was, in the end, downgraded, and Mayne instead received a fourth Distinguished Service Order, making him one of only a small handful of British servicemen in the entire war to receive that award 4 times, alongside earlier decorations that included being the first non-French recipient of certain French wartime honors, the Légion d'honneur and the Croix de Guerre. The reasons behind the downgrade have been debated for decades and remain genuinely unresolved. Some accounts point to Mayne's well-documented history of violent, unpredictable behavior, particularly when drinking, episodes that, whether entirely fair to hold against a soldier's combat record or not, may have counted against him in a decision-making process that was never purely about battlefield conduct alone. Other accounts suggest a more technical explanation, that the specific action in Germany involved multiple acts of bravery over an extended engagement rather than the kind of single, clearly bounded act of gallantry the Victoria Cross was traditionally awarded for, and that this technical distinction, rather than any judgment about Mayne's character, was what led review officers to downgrade the recommendation. King George VI himself reportedly expressed open surprise that Mayne had not received the award, and in 2005, more than 100 members of Parliament signed an early day motion in the House of Commons calling for the decision to be formally reconsidered. It has never been reversed. What is not in dispute is the scale of Mayne's overall combat record. Across the desert campaign, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany, few individual soldiers in the entire British Army amassed a comparable record of direct, close-range combat leadership, and fewer still combined that record with the kind of raw physical audacity, tearing aircraft apart with his bare hands when the explosives ran out, that turned Mayne into something closer to legend than ordinary military biography even within his own lifetime. The war that had made Paddy Mayne's reputation did not translate easily into peace. When the SAS was disbanded in October 1945, Mayne briefly joined a scientific expedition to the Falkland Islands, but was forced to withdraw early due to a severe back injury sustained during his wartime service, a physical toll that would trouble him for the rest of his life, and by several accounts, permanently ended any realistic prospect of returning to competitive rugby. He returned to Newtownards and resumed his pre-war profession as a solicitor, eventually becoming Secretary of the Law Society of Northern Ireland. By most accounts, his final decade was a quieter, more difficult chapter than the war years that preceded it, respected professionally, but privately marked by ongoing physical pain, heavy drinking, and periodic flashes of the same volatile temperament that had shadowed him since his rugby-playing youth. He never married, and detailed information about his personal life in this period remains relatively sparse compared to the extensively documented record of his wartime service. On the night of 13 December 1955, Mayne had been drinking at a Masonic lodge, gathering with a friend in nearby Bangor. Driving home in the early hours of the following morning in his Riley Roadster, he was involved in a collision with a farm vehicle and was found dead at the scene at the age of 40. He is buried in the family plot at Mouvilla Cemetery in Newtownards, not far from the town where he was born. History remembers Paddy Mayne primarily for a handful of vivid, almost unbelievable images: a man tearing aircraft instrument panels out with his bare hands on a darkened Libyan airfield, a soldier lifting wounded comrades into a jeep under fire in the closing weeks of the war in Europe. Those images are accurate, but they were never the whole picture. Behind them was a solicitor, an international rugby player, and a man whose extraordinary capacity for violence in combat existed alongside a personal life that never fully found the same discipline he brought to a battlefield. The Victoria Cross he was recommended for 4 times, but never received, remains, even today, one of the more persistently debated injustices in the history of British military honours. A fitting, unresolved footnote to a career defined, from its very first commando raid to its final and most famous airfield, by doing whatever the situation demanded, with whatever means were left in his hands.